Welcome to the last panel at this workshop, which is entitled What's Next? So it doesn't have any particular theme, just anything that you and our panelists decide to talk about, whatever direction you want to take. I'm Andrea LaPaugh. I'm on the faculty in computer science here, and I'm delighted to be able to welcome our panelists to this last workshop. First person who is going to be speaking is Jonathan Rochelle, and he's Senior Product Manager at Google Docs.
Hi. I'll probably just go through, hopefully it won't seem like rambling. I'll try to make some specific points, but I guess to start, I'll just be clear that I'm definitely a believer. It's probably obvious given the product I work on. A big believer in computing in the cloud. I've always felt it was going to grow even faster than it has. So it hasn't met my expectations necessarily, but now it feels like it finally is. My basis for that mostly is out of value for almost everyone involved. I feel strongly that the value for vendors and for customers is there. I was involved in software development when distribution required diskettes, and that was extremely painful. I'll never forget something known as Ginny May Day. I don't know if anybody here is in the financial service industry, but I used to have to go on the 15th of the month to one of our biggest clients at the time from the bank that I worked at, and I used to have to wait for data to download over, call it a 300 or 1200 baud modem, and an alternative to that was I could bring 40 diskettes with me, and we could bring the data, and then I could sit there all day as a software engineer and load up data on there. That was the way our software worked. It was the only way. And if we had changes to software, again, I would visit the client, bring the diskettes, reload the software, basically wipe out their hard drive from start since they were so small at the time. But generally, the value of having software distribution, just that supply chain over the web, will, I think, drive that model, not just because it's good for vendors, but because it's good for customers. And I don't know when the last time is somebody here had to actually upgrade their software compared to what it was like, I don't know, even 3 years ago, maybe 4 or 5. The process is just much simpler. It's much more automatic, and I think as a customer of software, almost every one of us now, it's a benefit to us. So, higher margin for vendors, lower prices for customers. I think all that stuff will come true, and it's just computing in the cloud for me is a positive thing. The most recent other awareness I've had is I got one of the XO computers from the One Laptop Per Child program, which was, I wasn't sure what to expect, and I was really blown away by it. For me, it was actually, I guess one laptop per 2 children. Somebody pointed out that I only got one of them, even though I've got 2 kids that wanted to use it and fought over it. But it was clear that something that physically light and from a software perspective light was extremely functional because almost everything I do is on the web. And so I could actually carry this little thing around that looks like a Fisher-Price toy, and it's extremely functional, and people, really can sit down and use it for anything, virtually anything. In fact, even more than what they would use their computer on their desktop for. Video and audio and things like that, and chatting and understanding who's around you is actually easier on that computer than it is on some of our desktops. The other thing I believe is that, just generally, and I think I kind of pointed to this, capitalism is going to drive improvements in some of the risks in computing in the cloud. I think privacy and security and ubiquitous identification and things, those things I think will come because consumers like us demand it. And there's value there. So producing better products, it's the same thing that happened with spam control and things like that. There's a very strong drive, there's a motivation in money to create better products in those areas. So I think those will come as well. Even things like attribution of source of data. It makes sense because if you provide a product that strongly attributes the source of data, other people will support it and buy it and take it. Collaboration is definitely another trend. It's not it's not very insightful. I understand it's kind of something obvious now, but clearly collaboration is something that's going to be driven strongly by computing in the cloud. It's something that makes it's just much easier. Statefulness in the cloud and collaboration actually together are very powerful. The other point that I feel is one of the strongest, maybe for this audience, but clearly for the audience I talk to in the developer community, is micro-innovation. And that's not necessarily an official term. It's probably somebody's got a trademark on it, so I'll just deny any knowledge of it because I have no idea. But to me, micro-innovation means an individual now has the capability to produce something that can bring them great value because the distribution model and the tools and the capabilities and the platforms on which that can be distributed are very easy now and functional. Whereas in the past, it was very hard. You almost had to go through more legal process to protect because there wasn't a clear understanding of, well, who was the first person to create this and to put it out on a platform. And now it's much easier. You can create a gadget, and that gadget can bring thousands and thousands of customers almost instantaneously from the point of distribution. And the platform and everything is predefined. It's all there. So along with that, some of the increase in I call it micro-innovation and thinking about programs, things that are functional. But I think that's true in content as well. If I have interesting content, if I'm a great writer, or I just have, ideas or very specific data that I've pulled together, that in itself can become very valuable. And because now there's money involved in great content more easily than there used to be, and through blogging I think was the most obvious example, there's value there. And there'll be a differentiation, I think, of commoditized content versus very high value content. And the other theme that I think is really worth discussing, and maybe there'll be questions about this as well, but is integration. Integration of services now is much more automatic and seamless. It's very, mashups is the cool term, I guess, or at this point it's probably, Wired probably calls it tired at this point. But mashups are easy to create, and if I have a service that I think is interesting, I can make it a component that can be mashed up, and suddenly it becomes part of a larger valuable product or service. And that actually is very different. And I think, again, regardless of the fact that I work for Google, I saw it first in Maps, and Maps now has become the gadget of choice, or call it the service of choice for mashups. Every time somebody mentions mashups, they want to mash up a map, and that's just a great example. But there's so many other things you can do with mashups, and so I love the fact that as a developer, you can create something really interesting, very high value, but very small, that can be an incredibly important component of many other things that are much bigger. And I believe that that's a fantastic addition to sort of the software development value chain. I think it lets people work remotely more easily, work alone more easily, work in smaller groups and collaboratively more easily. So it's kind of an operational development that's really great. And web services, it makes web services kind of finally come to life, it feels like anyway. So it's a new supply chain. And I think that supply chain has created, and we'll probably hear more about this from the other panelists, is there's infrastructure and platforms, and there's platforms for creating gadgets and widgets and apps, and then there's actually instances of types of gadgets, and then instances of those that are very content specific or vertical. So that's, I think, critical. With that will come the need for service level agreements in a much stronger way eventually. I think right now there's a lot of kind of conscious avoidance of SLAs, and that will change. I'm sure that that's going to be something that will be much more in the forefront for even these small providers, and there'll be a new commoditized service probably to help people with SLAs, particularly when they don't have the wherewithal to do it themselves. There'll be kind of I expect almost like an agent model. Somebody that represents developers that have all these services, because they can be on a platform that gives you all the commoditized stuff around it, legal and SLA and support and service. So a service level agreement basically says, let's say I create a map service, right, and I let people mash up things, and suddenly they create things that other people depend on, and they tell these people you can depend on, and maybe they even charge for it, and suddenly I decide I don't really like delivering this little map service that other people might have done or might not have done something with. I turn it off. Suddenly everybody else's stuff gets turned off and goes away, and they realize, oh my God, we never even talked to that developer or understood whether there was a commitment to provide that service. And that's the a real explicit kind of cliche example, but that's sort of the example of SLAs. And again, I come from a world where SLAs took a year to finalize, and it's really annoying. It's wonderful to ignore them, but that won't be possible, I don't think. So do-it-yourself tools and sort of web development tools, I think, will get a lot better, but those SLAs will be critical. The other thing that's sort of, getting to the issues, and I guess I should talk about issues as well as part of this, so you're not going to cover it across the board, but issues that I think will arise. I think one of the most obvious will be content and service ownership. So with SLAs kind of becomes an awareness of, okay, where do I get all the things I need to get? And that includes open source as well, to say, well, really, if I get stuff from open source, I better really be aware of it. And this is something that obviously at a company like Google I have to really be explicit about, and I have to make sure. The lawyer always asks me before we launch, did you incorporate any new open source? Let's make sure we cover all that. And that's something we're very aware of. But it's easy to not be aware until you're suddenly launching something, or after you launch something. And if you're not part of a larger company that's got somebody sort of breathing down your neck and saying, let's make sure we do everything the right way. But ownership of other things too, data and services that you're using. There's a good example, I think. Increased collaboration and increased integration of services brings about a sudden awareness that there is no obvious ownership model on some of this stuff. So, for example, I get a call from our support team. Somebody just contacted us and said that they've been working on a document with 10 other people for the past month, and they were just shut out. The person that owns the document physically has shut them out of that document. They no longer have access. And, okay, who owns that document? 10 people collaborated on it. One person created it and then invited 10 others, and then maybe they never did anything else with it, but they created it. And that is a model, that's it's not unique to one service. We're going to see that all over the place, and it's going to be, I think, one of the issues that has to be, again, I think it'll be resolved a little bit through product. The products will support that stuff really well, and that'll become important to people, and those are the features that will be pushed to provide. But I see that as one of the issues that will certainly become more aware of. That's it.
Thank you. Our next panelist is Jesse Robbins, who's part of O'Reilly, and also the co-chair of the Velocity Web Performance and Operation Conference. Jesse.
So I come to this workshop from a bit of a non-traditional background, and I'm actually going to pick up on the SLA thing to explain what those are in a little bit more detail. So I'm a firefighter, EMT, and emergency manager, and I happen to also be a technologist, and so I sort of meld the two in very strange ways. And I'm going to tell you just a very quick story about my experiences with SLAs and actually Google Maps during Hurricane Katrina, where I was a task force leader during Operation Hurricane Katrina. The simple story is that the Red Cross had integrated Google Maps using the standard go to Google, type in an address mapping technology that we all use in our daily lives into their response planning for shelter placement. And my team was doing tactical deployment of shelters, basically the structures in Hancock County, which was the county that was worst hit out of all of them. And I kept on having this crazy conversation with the Red Cross, which amounted to this. I was standing at the I-90 bridge, which was fully and completely destroyed in Bay St. Louis. And they would go to and I would ask for directions to find the next shelter location, which was usually a combination of sort of road map stuff and the other sources of data, because there were no standing street signs. We had some GPS and other things. But the important point here is that the American Red Cross would go to the Google website and look at what they believed was a satellite view of a real-time satellite view of the bridge. And they would direct me to go over the bridge, and they could not function without saying, go, take the I-90 bridge. Well, the bridge is destroyed. No, it isn't. I'm looking at it on Google Maps. So, So it's fascinating, and I use this because it's not Google's fault that that happened. You know, I'm not angry at the Google Mapping team. It's the American Red Cross's fault. They started using a service and they didn't have an explicit agreement or really an understanding of the consequences of the technology that they were adopting. And so what they needed was an agreement, a service level agreement with Google that would have allowed Google to say, for instance, the data that you're looking at is about 2 years old or maybe older, and it may not reflect reality. It certainly should not be used to reflect reality in, say, the largest national disaster in history. And so that's an example of what happens when people adopt technology and make policy. The interesting part of all of this is that was a policy decision. And those sorts of decisions have consequences and require a shift in thought. So I'm going to break away from the SLA conversation now and talk about some other stuff that's related. But it's a really good example of some of the challenges and issues that are going to emerge. People depend on these technologies these new technologies that we're creating, and when they go away suddenly or when that model does not work for them, there's a potential for people to be really hurt. And that is the issue that brings me here today, and really is the core of my passion. I want the technology that we build to make people safe, happy, and free. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of the next steps in making that happen. One of which is, so first of all, a lot of the questions over the past day or 2 days have used Amazon and Google and the cloud interchangeably. And that's interesting because it demonstrates what's happening in terms of public perception, and even among relatively savvy or very, very technology savvy people. So the cloud is this thing. It's there. Like, what is electricity? It's what comes out of the plug. You don't think about the whole grid that's behind it, nor are people really thinking about the places that the cloud computing infrastructure comes from. So I want to describe it a little bit more, which is cloud computing is part of a larger trend that at O'Reilly we call Web 2.0, which is the shift from running things in isolation to running them on the web and increasingly interconnected. And the interesting part is that the cloud computing part specifically is the transition from IT as a competitive advantage to IT as a commodity. My friend Simon Wardley has a really kind of fun way of describing this, which is yesterday's hot stuff becomes today's boredom. And that's in fact what's happening. Who here, raise your hand if you really, really, really want to run your own server to write a blog. Okay, one guy. I make my living doing this, and I don't want to do it. It's terrible. It's the most frustrating, awful work. And so what companies like Google and Amazon and others are beginning to do is really create a new utility, a utility computing service, and that includes storage and some other things. And so just as few of us today run our own power plants, and we're not generating our own electricity, pretty soon very few of us are going to run our own data centers for computing. That's essentially the cloud computing in a nutshell, and the shift that's occurring. So what does that mean? Well, it means that right now we are focused on winning what in my circles we call a platform play. So what everybody who is currently entering the market in the utility computing space or cloud computing or whatever you want to call it, they are working to build a platform on which the most number of people depend as quickly as possible. To quote Jeff Bezos from long ago, talking about Amazon as a merchant, the strategy is to get big fast. And so essentially you want everyone depending on your particular brand of electricity as quickly as possible. The winners are going to have the advantage of network effects. So as he just described, it's really cheap and easy to build cool stuff using this new technology. You don't have to run a server in a data center anymore. You can start building gadgets and widgets applications and web services very, very effectively without having to do all this stuff that you previously had to do. Just as an appliance builder that wants to, make a KitchenAid mixer didn't have to extend the national grid all the way to the person's kitchen in order to be able to make the appliance. And that's really what we're talking about. The appliance is an application in this case. So be that, a blog service or Twitter or any other service like that. There are these old web hosting companies that are dying. They're going to disappear because of a disruptive pricing model called utility pricing. So unfortunately what's going to happen to many of these providers, the sort of Web 1.0 core infrastructure, is they're going to go away. They're going to be replaced by utility computing like Amazon EC2 and S3, 3 Tera, services that I'm sure Google and Microsoft will be offering, and many, many others, including some people in this room. Is it AppLogic or no?
That's Nexus.
AppNexus. So there's plenty of interest in this space, and we're all trying to win the platform play. One of the parts of this is that we all erect these very high exit costs. So when you build your widget on Google or on Amazon or on anywhere, that it's harder to move that application from running on Amazon to running on someone else's server, service, or product. Simply because that's currently the way we've built them, and there's no standardization. There's no common policy that says we're going to be able, that you should even be able to do that. It's an idea, but it's not something there. It's also currently not in the interest of getting your platform to grow big, because you don't want people leaving it. You want people instead encouraged to come and make it bigger and bigger and bigger. And so this is going to create lock-in. And lock-in is a very, very interesting thing. So there's going to be a couple of very large platform players. So people that have lots and lots of customers, lots of people that depend on them. And then there's going to be these smaller groups of people who are going to probably, I believe this is going to happen, do something called federation, where we say, hey, I don't want to have to plug my KitchenAid mixer into your special proprietary socket. Instead, what if we all gathered together, made our own common standards for electrical current and sockets and other things like that, and we cooperate together so I can go to my friend's house and plug in the same KitchenAid mixer. And they'll end up competing instead on things like price and performance and perhaps availability. The idea of having much more reliable systems which are more expensive versus less reliable systems that are cheaper. So federation is something that is very likely to happen simply because it is a way to compete with for a small group to gather together as a cooperative and compete with an established large player. Incidentally, I would like to build and become the established large player, as would every one of us that starts off down this road. So I'm a big fan of federation, but that might change if I become very successful and wealthy. So don't think I'm a bad person. It's just how it works. I'll get to that in a minute, actually. The larger companies, though, the big companies are going to begin to be viewed as one of two things: monopolies or utilities, both of which are regulated, through policy. I have this phrase that I used with Skype because I was very I should check my time, but I was very upset after the 2-day outage for Skype, and I said that you become what you disrupt. Skype did not want to admit that it was a replacement telephone service for the millions of people that relied on it. And when it was down for 2 days, it did real harm. Interestingly, it did real harm when the large Peru earthquake occurred. And it was, in fact, the primary communication methodology for hundreds of thousands of affected people who had the internet but couldn't make phone calls because they were locked into a single utility. So it's an interesting case where just because you are an innovator doesn't mean that you're not going to become a monopoly or a utility. And interestingly enough, now there is a renewed push for regulation of Skype. So getting back to the making things safe or making people safe, happy, and free through technology, The interesting part of all this is that none of the innovators think of themselves as becoming large and at monopolies or utilities. Even if we use the term utility computing, I don't want to be regulated. I don't want to have to make you mad and have regulatory conversations and people pushing for oversight and change. I want to be innovative. I want to have fun. I want to build new cool stuff. And so there is a new dialogue that needs to happen about technology and policy. It is not about legislation. It is about changing the culture of technologists and innovators in order to ensure that people understand the consequences of the technology that they create and their responsibility as stewards and guardians to people who depend on them for their daily lives, their daily infrastructure. And the solution doesn't begin with legislation. It's an interesting problem. I don't want to see it start off with regulation. I don't want to see it start off with lawsuits. What I would like is to see more dialogues like these between traditional academia, between the legal community, between the emerging policy communities, and technology people who, up until this point, have largely not been engaged. And so I think that I don't really have an answer for what the future is going to look like, but what I hope it looks like is a greater degree of partnership and open discussion about creating technology that makes people safe, happy, and free. And that begins here, and I hope with other organizations. And so basically I am committed to seeing this sort of thing happen more frequently, and I invite you all to do the same.
Thanks, Jesse. Our last panelist is Reihan Salam, an editor at The Atlantic and also author of a forthcoming book entitled The Grand New Party.
Hi, everyone. So I have a problem, which is that I hardly ever make sense, even to the people who are nearest and dearest to me. So there's an excellent chance that this is going to be a strange blur, and I apologize for that. No, not really. That's okay. So I have a lot of bullet points. I started out with about 12 bullet points. Over the course of this conference, that number of bullet points has radically expanded. So I'm going to just try to kind of prune them down and see what I can do. First, I just want to talk about the Gastarbeiter who were brought to Western Europe in the 50s and 60s. Now, everyone thought this is a great solution. This is a way to kind of help our economies run really smoothly and really well. We're going to bring these people from North Africa and the Middle East, and sort of oftentimes from Yugoslavia and elsewhere. These are quiescent populations. These are totally peaceful people. They're going to be great workers, and then they're going to go back home, and that's going to be great. It's going to be a way to kind of power up at this process of kind of rapid innovation and rapid economic growth that's been happening in our country. What they didn't realize is that a lot of the people they thought were eventually going to go home ended up staying for a really long time. They ended up staying and having children who couldn't find work in the same jobs their parents had because a lot of those industries vanished. That is to say, a lot of crazy, unanticipated problems emerged. Now, what does this have to do with utility computing? That's an excellent question. And what it has to do is basically they're trying to solve a pretty similar problem. Like when you think about this tremendous amount of raw computing power that we're introducing that's really, really cheap and that's clearly transforming a lot of industries, making things possible that weren't possible before. Similarly, having kind of low-wage labor coming into a country that can kind of allow us to scale up a lot of stuff. It allows us, for example, to allow women who hadn't been in the workforce before to become a lot more creative and to participate in areas of the economy that they hadn't participated in before. It gives us a tremendous amount of freedom. And of course, the other big difference is that, computers aren't people, and people introduce a lot of kind of kooky complications. But when you look at the contemporary United States and look at the way that our debates surrounding the labor force, the demographic composition of the labor force have changed recently. What I'm talking about is this massive upsurge in xenophobia that we've seen, to put it really bluntly. This is something that you couldn't necessarily have predicted sort of 10, 15 years ago when people were talking about a kind of shiny, happy future about multiculturalism in kind of very bright terms. But what's interesting is that, kind of the hostility to immigration is really tightly related to a lot of, kind of profound middle-class anxiety, a lot of anxiety tied to things that are actually pretty unrelated to immigration, that are actually closely related to technical change. So now a lot of the hostility that we see towards things like immigration and also free trade, really, is it possible that this really should be hostility directed towards dramatic innovation sort of in machines? Now that sounds really strange, and I'm absolutely no Luddite. I'm someone who's very excited about these technologies. But I mean, when you think about, kind of this backlash against immigration, where did it come from? It wasn't anticipated. We now think that Americans love technology, Americans love sort of all the things that it gives us. But can you imagine some kind of ferocious reaction? I think the answer is yes. It's happened in the past, and it could happen in the future. And given the scale of the changes we're seeing, and this is something that Jesse, sort of touched on, the last kind of change we saw along these lines, the last kind of truly epochal change, was the rise of the electricity grid. The rise of the electricity grid also gave us, some would argue, including journalist Nicholas Carr and others, the Fordist political economy that sort of shaped the world of mid-century. What do I mean by that? So, you can really have an assembly line when you were using a windmill or when you're using a water mill, because actually when you're talking about the pulleys and levers that it took to run machines, it was just really, really hard. But once you were able to plug something into a wall, then you were able to radically scale up the sophistication, the technical sophistication of sort of these factories. Okay, whatever, blah, blah, blah. Now, that relates to what Jesse's talking about in terms of, kind of IT departments going away. You're going to be able to do stuff that we can't even imagine. And actually, that's one thing that I've been a little disappointed with in our conference so far. Cloud computing, I mean, sort of, it's not just sort of a really dramatic increase in scale and efficiency. What it means is that there are going to be applications we can't even imagine, sort of in terms of using this kind of emerging worldwide computer, being able to kind of plug into these services. And, so there's this little company called 23andMe, and a lot of you, I'll bet, have heard of it. This is a company that is drawing on cloud computing resources. They're, kind of have very close personal relationships with some of the higher ups at Google. And what they're doing is they're allowing you to kind of sequence your genome and get sort of some kind of broad inferences about your disease risks for less than $1,000. Now, that seems like sort of a cute trick and sort of something that'll be kind of interesting for people, kind of as an intellectual toy. But what it will also do is completely destroy the private insurance marketplace as we know it. That's a pretty big disruption, and that's a disruption that relates really closely with a lot of really weighty public policy debates we're having right now. Jesse sort of was, I think, hinting at some of this when he was talking about the emergence of this as a utility that people depend on. When he was talking about Skype in Peru, I was thinking, well, I mean, isn't it the fault of Peru's telephone company? Sort of their public monopoly, they're so crappy that actually people have had to leapfrog over that basic telephone infrastructure so that they can sort of use this disruptive innovation that was never intended to be used as kind of the telephone provider of last resort. Well, I mean, we're going to see a lot more of this kind of leapfrogging. We're going to see a lot of cases where, regulators are going to be trying to catch up. And then eventually we're going to see what happened with the electricity grid. This was dominated by tinkerers, entrepreneurs, innovators, and then it became dominated by government. It became a series of regulated monopolies, and it also became a series of state-owned companies. So when the state is owning sort of the utility, particularly in a case like this where it's controlling a lot of sensitive information, that has a lot of interesting implications itself. But then when you're talking about the massive disruption in terms of the medical marketplace and the insurance marketplace, it means that the role of government is going to have to become a lot bigger, a lot more significant. Again, this is something that's deriving from what we think of as, kind of neat little technological advances that we're all excited about. But sort of going further downstream, it's going to have a lot of really kind of unpredictable consequences. Then there's also the issue of white collars turning blue. I think the last decade has made fools of a lot of people who've tried to be seers. One person it hasn't made a fool out of is Paul Krugman, Princeton's own Paul Krugman, who wrote a piece in 1996 called When White Collars Turn Blue that I highly recommend to any of you. He predicted a lot of things, including the rise of the celebrity economy in response to dramatic increases in computing power that no one else really saw. He also predicted that it would have radical sort of change in terms of, again, folks who are involved in routine information processing. Just as the number of people who work in manufacturing in the United States now is tiny, the number of people who are in sort of a lot of the kind of conventional white-collar jobs that became the bedrock of the, proto-information economy at mid-century, these jobs are going to vanish. So what are folks going to do? Well, what Alan Blinder said in the context of the offshoring argument is that they were going to go into in-person services. But the thing about in-person services, like, being a teacher, being a home healthcare attendant, et cetera, is that these are things that are subject to Balmos-Cost disease. These are also things that relate to kind of issues that we care about so intimately that oftentimes we don't want to leave them in the hands of the private sector. Baumol's cost disease, it's basically this idea that, kind of when you have sort of big increases in productivity in some areas, for example, manufacturing, sort of there are other areas where you actually can't scale up productivity that much. For example, teaching a class. You can teach a class of 30 people. Maybe you can try to bump that up to 60 people, but then you're actually kind of having problems with scaling up, particularly because of the presence of disruptive students, et cetera. So, that means that actually the number of people in the workforce who are in these productivity laggards, that number inches up and up and up. And this is something that you see with the public sector workforce, et cetera. So, Michael Mandel, sort of a business correspondent at Business Week, he argues that the healthcare economy is what's managed to keep us out of recession, and that's been responsible for any of the net job increases that we've seen over the Bush years. But again, what are these healthcare jobs that are being created? They're not sort of these radically sort of interesting, sort of like innovative jobs. They're home healthcare attendants that elderly people need. If you look at the baby boomer generation, about a fifth of these folks don't have any children. In August 2003 in France, you had a situation where a lot of elderly people, literally thousands, I think it was over 2,000 people died in their homes because it got really, really hot. Again, what does this have to do with cloud computing? Well, what it has to do with cloud computing is that social isolation is going to be one problem that we're going to try to solve through cloud computing, but we can't. We're going to still need people. We're going to still need sort of that grit. And that's going to have a lot of weird economic consequences. So, what I'm saying is that we're going through an epochal shift that's as big as the epochal shift of moving to electrification. That's as big as moving in the direction of Fordist political economy. But when, you had the Fordist economy, what it did is it radically increased the size of the middle class. But then when we were talking about micro-innovations earlier on, these are micro-innovations that do tremendous stuff for the really tiny number of people. Look at this in terms of power laws, the tiny number of people who are competent to work with these technologies and, kind of who are going to be able to draw into sort of, to innovate through analogy, et cetera. But sort of the people who are in that kind of long tail of kind of not fully understanding the stuff, seeing their jobs become obsolete at an ever faster rate. And this is the potential beginning of a really serious political backlash. So I think the challenge for political thinkers, and when I look at the kind of left-right spectrum and the kind of things that we do talk about, I'm really dispirited, because what we really need to do is try to see that we're kind of maintaining a constituency for technological openness, for kind of dynamism in the economy, and being sure that we actually kind of help people buy in to these ideas. This is very personal for me because I belong to an industry that is dying. Not only is it dying, but I've actually seen it die before my very eyes. I remember when I took a job at the New York Times as an op-ed editor. I was walking around the building, and then someone said to me, "Hey, Reihan, you're one of the rats jumping on the sinking ship." And then I was smiling and laughing, but everyone around me, they were frowning and sort of looking incredibly dour. Yeah, and of course, they were right in a very narrow sense. I mean, there are going to be people who are going to be doing this kind of work. There are going to be a handful of writers who embrace micro-innovation and who kind of find their own platform, who find their place in what Paul Krugman called the celebrity economy, who will have their fans. But then, even in the online space between 2001 and 2007, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the number of people who work in online publishing and broadcasting declined by 29%. And again, that's the most growing and flourishing part of that little slice of the economy, a slice of the economy that, let me just acknowledge, we're incredibly solipsistic, and you just sort of care a lot about ourselves. Offshoring only became an issue when in I think it was in 2003, there was a Wire story about how Indians are becoming journalists now. Look out, and suddenly it was something that we all had to panic about. So again, I'm someone who's pretty skeptical about the idea that everything's going to hell, blah, 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 9 times out of 10. And I don't think everything's going to hell. People are going to find new work. People are going to become massage therapists, for example. They're going to give massages to other massage therapists in a kind of endless circle of massage. But then sort of what I do worry about is if you do have kind of utility computing becoming a bigger and more important part of the economy, if you do see regulators who want to kind of have more weight in that because it becomes so critical to kind of our future and to kind of like sort of public flourishing. So then where are you going to see the space for kind of private innovation and entrepreneurship when, again, because of the Baumol cost disease, you have a large number of people who are kind of working in jobs that are not terribly productive. They're being redistributed to so that they can actually function sort of at a level that we consider sort of decent and humane. It's going to be really, really weird and really, really unfamiliar, just in the way that, kind of the Fordist economy, you couldn't have predicted that from like 1890. So this is stuff that I'm still puzzling through and thinking about and struggling with. There are like about 12 other bullet points, but I'm going to spare you guys that and then, kind of leave it to questions.
You sure?
Yeah.
Thank you, Ryan. There must be questions from the audience.
Thank you all for speaking. Reihan, I just had a quick question. You mentioned that you thought that that this cloud computing innovation provides improvements in productivity for a very specific small class of people who are. Was that not what you said?
I'm sorry. Please continue.
I thought you said something like the improvements made life easier for a small group of people who are capable of working with these technologies. Is that?
I definitely don't think that's right. I think it actually means dramatic improvements for everyone. But what I mean is that the number of people who are going to be able to capitalize on it effectively and sort of build wealth. I mean, I think that, Richard Freeman introduced this kind of controversial, kooky idea of the global labor glut, which I think is kind of a problematic idea in a lot of ways, but it is very simple and easy to understand. The idea is that if you look at the global economy as we understand it, it was a lot smaller when there was a Soviet bloc. It suddenly doubled in size, but the amount of capital in the world didn't double in size. So people who own capital, kind of are really, really lucky. And if you look at a lot of things like the commodification of the startup process, et cetera, the number of people who actually are gaining access to kind of really sophisticated, efficient capital markets has definitely increased. It's increased a lot. It's one of the greatest and most wonderful things about living in the world today. But again, that it's not universal. The number of people who actually can sort of draw on this stuff, it's still pretty small. So again, it's making everyone a lot more productive and efficient. But I mean, sort of, kind of the other question is, look at Ian Dubaker and Robert Gordon and their work about where have the productivity gains gone in the economy. During the Fordist era, if I was like a kind of not terribly well-educated dude who just kind of worked, went to Detroit and worked in this factory, I didn't suddenly become like radically more brilliant and innovative and productive. I was just using these amazing machines. But then because of a kind of political settlement, because of a lot of kind of quirky circumstances, Henry Ford and a bunch of other people decided to give me a bigger wage, partly because they had to, because it was kind of soul-deadening work. And a lot of our work now is like play, so you can't really sort of say that. And then, of course, kind of like people are a lot more affluent in a lot of ways. Our consumption is of much higher quality. So what I'm saying is that in terms of the people who are going to kind of gain a lot of economic power, and I don't think this is necessarily true, but it seems that actually that number is a bit narrower than it was during the last massively disruptive wave of innovation.
My own personal experience has just been that the cloud computing tools available make developing and launching services on the web significantly easier for groups of people who couldn't possibly have even considered programming in the past.
Totally. Absolutely.
So I just wanted clarification on the statement you're making.
Absolutely. I think that's absolutely true. But then let's say, even if let's say that we're talking about 15% of the population that suddenly learns how to kind of use these tools, there you're going to see like sort of like a really uneven distribution in terms of who is going to create the really valuable innovations. A and B. Then you have that other 85% of the population, the kind of people who are really important in terms of political backlash and other stuff.
Hello, I'm Andrew Appel of Princeton University. So this has been a great panel. It's been really fun to watch, all of you. About 10 years ago, I saw a great talk by Brian Reed at Bell Labs, and he explained that if you only have one of something, you can't throw it away and start over. And he was talking about the public switch telephone network, and in 1980 there was only one of it, so you couldn't throw it away and start over. And AT&T, of course, was resisting as much as it possibly could, and in every way it could, the advent of the packet switch network that we now have. But by 1997, when he gave this talk, and he described the way that the Internet had eaten away closer and closer to the core of the public switch telephone network, so that by 1997 was just about the time when it was thrown away and we could start over. And so it seems like that's what each of you has been talking about, different things that we will be throwing away and starting over with in the next few years. And the first thing that comes to mind, of course, in cloud computing is that we will throw away the commodity monopoly operating system, sold by the sponsor of this conference. But what are the other specific things that maybe you haven't mentioned yet that we will be throwing away and starting over with in the next few years?
Well, I'll just say that, whether or not Microsoft is a sponsor of the conference, Microsoft is in many markets a fast follower, and they are building out as or more aggressively than Google in terms of square feet of data centers and installed servers, and are being, as far as I know, very innovative. And so I suspect that while we may move away from Microsoft as the desktop platform, that they will continue to be a market leader in a number of ways, just as Google is currently a market leader using similar techniques and technology. So I think that while if there's anti-Microsoft sentiment, I certainly
Yeah.
I've had it at various times. I think that they have an interesting approach, and I'm always happy when there's more players in a market. So I definitely think we're going to cast off the relevance of a desktop operating system eventually. So that's one thing that we will, anyone's. One of the other things I think we're going to be fortunately casting off as part of this is extremely wasteful consumption of energy. So a place that Google is an innovator and is actually, like lots of other companies that think at scale are beginning to follow suit, is in how you run your data centers and how much power they consume. So if you're building a 21 to 50 megawatt data center and you're subverting a huge amount of or co-opting a huge amount of a power generation capability, I want to make sure that we're doing that that those companies are doing that as efficiently as possible, and in such a way that it's better than running a distributed system of people's desktops where it may not be the most effective way of getting power there. So I hope one thing we're casting off is inefficient distribution of systems. Unfortunately, centralization results in centralization of risk. So there's a push and a pull there. So if you've got a large data center, one fire can take that out. If you have lots of data centers owned by different companies, location becomes a single point of failure. So there's interesting things to consider there.
The other area I think we're going to see change, and it's funny because I recently saw some merger deals or acquisition deals that surprised me because I think they were focused around, I guess for lack of a better term, syncing. I think we'll see synchronization tools across platforms go away because there will be no need for syncing. In other words, I have an extremely strong belief that all my stuff will be accessible no matter where I am through many devices because it resides in one place or multiple places but delivered to me wherever I happen to be. And I think that changes development tools as well. I think we'll see a lot of development tools thrown away, and we've already seen that. And I think it's a fantastic development in that area. I think really, being agnostic to language is finally there. I can really develop in any language I want using whatever tools I want. It's just that I don't have to do it for a specific platform. Even open social that Google happened to sponsor and try to collect people around, it goes against the idea of lock-in, and it tries to make it so that these micro-innovations and creation of functional content. It used to be that if I had content, I would put it in a form, let's just call it flat content. It's text or it's images or it's video or something that once it's created. And you can, really protect it in some way, at least legally. Now there's functional content. They're just applications that work in a certain way. It's such an advantage to be able to distribute that on multiple platforms. And to be able to develop it in a way so it can be distributed on multiple platforms is a huge win. Very challenging. So I don't disagree with what Jesse was saying, that there will be natural lock-in on certain platforms, but trying to drive a goal against that is, I think, really important. And the other thing I think we're going to unfortunately throw away, trying to stick with your question, is a lot of phones, a lot of laptops, a lot of devices that are in this gap between what's sort of good and what's perfect for us. Like they're so cheap now. You look at even iPods. I saw this, I'll never forget, once I was in London when mobile phones really here were nowhere. But in London they were still everywhere. And I saw somebody drop a phone, look back and saw that it was cracked, and just keep walking. And I was amazed. And I realized that in London they were already at a point where these things were disposable. And here I see it with iPods. I've got like my old iPod I just found sitting on my desk. It's like an old 10 gig iPod that I haven't used because I got one of the newer ones. Somebody bought me a newer one, and I thought, wow, what a waste. And my old laptop from, my prior job is sitting there. No, I didn't steal it. It was my company. It was okay. And but there's going to be a lot of waste. And so although, I think it's almost necessary that we offset that with better, use of energy in other areas, but we should almost all try to resist that also.
Just following up on Jonathan's point, it's interesting that you're talking about literally throwing away laptops and these other tools because, I know that Jonathan Zittrain's sort of big worry, and I think that it makes sense to some extent, is this idea that, kind of this framework of technology we used to have was this kind of generative network, and the idea of kind of these all-purpose computers rather than dumb terminals, which kind of allow people to kind of tinker with them, this idea of the kind of homebrew computing. And granted, the number of people who are going to be doing that is always going to be pretty small, but the fact that this was the kind of pervasive technology sort of like inclined you, biased you in the direction of kind of generative framework, and this has clearly had a lot of kind of pretty big cultural implications. So I think the idea of like moving in the direction of information appliances kind of introduces a lot of these similar risks in terms of, the kind of serendipity with which, hey, I'm going to tinker around with this thing that happens to sort of be here because this happens to be the only way I can have like powerful computing available to me. But the otof thing that I kind of was thinking of a little tangentially with regard to throwing stuff away is the idea of, kind of my hero, Steve Mann, the original cyborg at the University of Toronto, who kind of sued the government when, kind of they demanded that he kind of remove some of the kind of crazy plugins he had in his brain. And, this isn't very popular. This isn't very common. We don't generally want to become cyborgs. But then I was thinking about this in the context of something that an O'Reilly blogger had said a little while ago, Nat Torkington. He talked about social graph gluttony. And sometimes I think about, kind of if you look at Facebook as it's used by, for example, 15, 16-year-olds, how differently it's used by them than it is by, say, 30-year-olds, and the ways that this stuff is affecting our brains, really meaningfully affecting our brains in terms of whether or not we kind of have this kind of pervasive noise all the time. There's this AI guy in Washington, Ben Goertzel, who talked about how, we have this global brain, but there's a danger of this global brain being a global nincompoop. But then it also means that, kind of this global brain has all this noise, and maybe actually all this noise will let us become smarter in interesting ways that we can't fully predict. But it also means that this kind of repose, the kind of silence that we used to be accustomed to before we had iPods, or before we had Walkman, or before we had telephones, this kind of thing. We're moving so far from that to kind of seeing our brains function in potentially radically different ways. And that has a lot to do with, kind of cloud computing being a first step, moving in the direction of ubiquitous computing and all these other ways that we're going to, without even really fully understanding or knowing it, becoming dependent on having this kind of hive mind surrounding us. So that's another thing that we might be kind of throwing away and not fully understanding what we're throwing away.
Taking a couple of steps back from our future as cyborgs and our collective intelligence as a hive mind, so one thing that's important in all of this is tinkering, and O'Reilly is a big supporter of the right to tinker. So one of the things that I believe is that this is going to enable people to do entirely new kinds of tinkering. Unfortunately, it's also going to mean the end of certain other kinds of tinkering. So, for example, people that really, really like building operating systems, of which I was once a proud member, and we have members of various open source advocacy organizations here who have what started off as tinkering and turned into the foundation of the economy that we're currently building. That kind of tinkering is going to be reduced, but it will breed new kinds of open source projects, new kinds of collaboration, new ways of sharing information, new ways of building new and more exciting stuff. And for every place that technology or centralization takes away an opportunity to tinker, it creates an incentive for somebody to get around it. And that's actually why I said we need to have a deeper engagement, not from a legal policy standpoint, but actually engage the tinkerers, get out of academia, get into the places where people actually just rip stuff apart and don't care what anybody says, because those are the places where the current iteration of internet technology has come from and certainly the next one will come from. So I'm not as worried, although I have plenty of friends that are starting to do more body hacking, more sort of interest in the final bridge between man and machine, and that it's an interesting discussion, and they call that tinkering. So and certainly it will probably soon be regulated. So it's an interesting place. So I'm not worried that the loss of access and the ability to innovate. I'm more worried that that's just always going to be so far out that there's no easy bridge, and it's 10 or 15 years before we're able to engage meaningfully in a conversation about it.
For the record, I actually want to become a cyborg, so I'm not worried about it either.
you. So I think one thing that's obvious to me at this point is that cloud computing brings or makes the commercial partners interested in it because it brings opportunities of efficiency and innovation. Unfortunately, those two values are not exactly very relevant in the government space. Governments are not traditionally innovative or efficient. Actually, I don't really have a question. I'm just wondering what are your thoughts at this intersection between government and cloud computing?
Yeah, this is not a political statement of who I would back, but if you got someone like a Michael Bloomberg, who's a businessman, looking at efficiency, I think that would change. And I think, again, I have no backing of Michael Bloomberg as president. It's just that I know that efficiency as a goal would very much adopt some of the technology that we see today. It would be an incredible change. I mean, I have to say, locally, when I think about how my children's schools operate, it's shocking and virtually puts me to tears when I see the forms that come home that I have to fill out. The continual repetition, and there is no ability or willingness to risk any change or to threaten the status quo or to even risk potentially, putting somebody's back up about privacy and things by putting data into a database. Something, let's move into the 70s and put this stuff somewhere where we can access it. And there's plenty of, I think, efficiencies and things that when the goal becomes efficiency, those things will be adopted. But right now, it doesn't seem like the goals are efficiency because, again, the powers that be and the people that are in office really, I don't think, are using that as their platform. They're not driving efficiency. They don't care that it's inefficient. They care about being elected, and they care about what's popular. And right now, it's too indirectly popular to be efficient.
It's interesting because the last panel was all about how this technology is and it can be used by people to change government, to change policy, to change that sort of thing. I spoke at the World Economic Forum in Istanbul, sponsored by the OECD, and the Director General of the OECD and their chief statistician, Enrico Giovini, said that they want to start driving a much greater adoption of exactly the stuff we've been talking about. Specifically, they even proposed something called Wiki Progress, which is a project to get national indicators on progress beyond GDP from various nations in order to be able to measure performance of nations and hopefully drive meaningful change. And so, it's certainly not representative of government as a whole, but there are certainly individuals within government that both get it, that really understand the benefits, unfortunately not always understanding clearly the risks, but that's why I'm encouraging more of these kinds of conversations. And I think that what you're going to find is that the more, people in general understand the power and potential of what we're trying to build, the more they will benefit from it as it just becomes obvious it's not an innovative thing anymore to have a wiki. Instead, it's just, of course we can trust people to edit a web page. So I think that there's a balance, and it's going to be slow, and I think that that's not necessarily a bad thing. But I think that the places where you see the beginnings of adoption of government 2.0. That adoption will be very fast because of the network effects that have resulted in exactly the rate of adoption that everyone else is experiencing. So I think that the answer is there will be a couple of innovators in government who will lead the way for a lot of other people, and it will just become, what was my quote? Yesterday's hot stuff becomes today's boredom. There you go.
Well, briefly, I mean, I think that, when you're talking, I think that actually Jonathan made a really astute observation when he was saying that there are people who just don't want efficiency. And when I think about, for example, Arnold Schwarzenegger's Crusade in 2005 and how it went down in flames, when the rent seekers are not like sort of grubby, horrible access capitalists that it's kind of really easy to rail against, but when they're actually like basically really sympathetic people, at least in theory, namely public school teachers are saying, kind of we want higher wages, oh, but wait, we actually don't want you to tamper with our work rules at all, et cetera, that kind of thing. I mean, these are kind of the people, this is where the rubber hits the road. And I think when you're looking at kind of those political arguments, it gets a lot thornier. And particularly when you're looking at this broader disruption in the economy, sort of the case for inefficiency, I fear, is actually going to become a lot more potent.
Quick question. I'm interested to hear you guys just talk a little bit about some of the social things coming down the pike, not from technical or economic terms, but more like, with the 15-year-olds putting stuff on Facebook that, when they're running for office or what have you, all that data isn't going anywhere, and what's that going to do to our society in general? Also, I just read recently that people's faith in the institution of the free press is dropped precipitously. That they don't trust the integrity of these institutions that we've developed over centuries. They're disappearing, and people's faith in them is disappearing without any clear replacement for them, which means this transition is going to be chaotic. And what are the parameters for what is a legitimate replacement for them? For a lot of people who are not in this, not really tuned into what's going on in Web 2.0 or what have you, they're out there with aging computers that, they're a little distrustful of the whole thing anyway. What kind of timeline before we sort of shift to the new paradigm, and what do you see going on in that?
So I'll take the data question, and then I'll leave the press question to, well, you knows, but
that was the one I was going to leave out too.
So I have a thing that it's an article I'm in the process of writing, in which basically I believe that collecting personal information, collected personal information, is the same as hazardous material. It served a purpose for a period of time, and the longer you hold on to it, the more dangerous it becomes, and it's really hard to get rid of. So one of the challenges that we all see, and this is why when you build technology, you're creating policy, is I'll tell another personal story, and at least it'll be finally on the record, so I don't have to worry that someone might find it. So years ago, I made a post asking about finding a fake ID. Many, many years ago, and I did it to Usenet because, that was the Facebook of our time. And there is a company which Google bought was called Deja News, which, unbeknownst to me at the time, was keeping a permanent record of every single posting to Usenet on a number of groups. And so I was surprised to find, with a little bit of digging, a request from a young Jesse Robbins about where I could find resources on acquiring a fake ID. Now, that entry persists. And so that is the worst thing that people can find about me, is, so at least it's finally out there in the open. And the interesting part is that, how long do we keep this stuff, and do we ever really delete it? How do we manage that? There are no standards right now. The current default behavior is to capture and store as much data as possible forever, because it's usually useful to people later, but not to the person to whom it is actually dangerous. So this is an interesting regulatory, maybe technology policy question. There are all these various things, and there are laws that are coming out, but that as a technologist I only find out about until the legal people tell me that, oops, actually we've got to manage data in this different way. That is a huge problem, because it's so easy to build a useful service right now without even remotely understanding the consequence of generating and collecting that data. Facebook went through this with the beacon thing, among other issues, and there are questions about Facebook's data gathering policies and practices. At the Web 2.0 Summit, an event that my company sponsors, or actually runs, I should say, I asked Mark Zuckerberg about who's the CEO of Facebook, or founder of Facebook, I should say, what his subpoena handling policies were. And his answer was very simple. I don't know. So we got to grow up, all of us. Like, we can build technology, we don't understand its consequences until other people who are regulating and legislating say, hey, by the way, you're in big trouble. I want to be so far ahead of that, where we're thinking about this as we're creating these things, so that we're making the right thing, which should be determined by all of us, happen by default. And it is not a competitive advantage to do the wrong thing.
And I think that awareness by users is really important. And I think it was Jesse that mentioned education at some point, but it's happening naturally amongst the 14 and 15-year-olds. In fact, in my house, it's happening amongst a 7-year-old, which is learning fairly quickly. And frankly, even just last night, my mother asked me, okay, I'm setting up an account. What should I give? Should I give a lot of information, a little? What's required, what's not? Is there an implication to me? And it was a hard question, but what I basically said was give as little as you can. If it's a service you really want to use, then give more as they require it. Or as you learn more about what that information will be used for, and this goes back to day one, I think there were some great points made about transparency and cookies and things like that. I'd love to see some advance in that. Then if you're educated about how the data is used, you can give what you want to give and what you're comfortable giving. A 14 and 15-year-old might not make the best choices until they go for their job application, 5 years, 6 years later, maybe more, and realize that, the interviewer is now paging through pictures of that person that were posted on MySpace or Facebook, and that awareness has started. And I think people are starting to understand that what they put out there might be permanent, it might be persistent, it might actually be looked at, and it's something that you've got to understand. But understanding the services you're using, being educated in the services you're using are critical. And I know recently at Google we were pushing this strongly. The privacy group within Google, they created a channel on YouTube where they would allow each of us about our products to say, yes, we love our product, it's great for collaboration, it's great for sharing, but here's some things that you should know about how to limit sharing and how to control sharing. You might not like the defaults we give you, so here's how you can change them, because some defaults, yes, 51% of our users want those, so we might set it that way, but 49% might want it the other way, and it's up to us to educate, and it's up to any user to understand what they're using the service for and how it'll be used.
Just to pick up on the question, I think that Emily Nussbaum wrote a really brilliant article for New York Magazine that I recommend, just about the Facebook piece and about evolving generational norms concerning privacy. I remember, when I first started at my current job, there was a young lady who wrote an article about Caroline Giuliani there. The article was based on having access to Caroline Giuliani's Facebook profile, and she saw that Caroline Giuliani had endorsed Obama and thought that this was an appropriate thing to write about. Now, a couple of the other interns in the office, kind of said to me, I wasn't really comfortable with her doing that. And actually, from that point on, kind of were a little bit less willing to have lunch with the woman who wrote this piece. But there was just this sense, that just wasn't kosher. But, again, there are other people. I mean, I think that, Nussbaum's core point, which I think was very, very smart, was that you were talking about a generation that's actually perhaps a lot more sophisticated about what's happening in privacy than we are. That is, they recognize that we're living increasingly in a completely transparent society. And so because it's very difficult to protect your information adequately, what they're doing is finding ways to cultivate and construct their public identity. So they're behaving the way that sort of, kind of one who is a public personality would behave. This behavior is kind of, being universalized, but I thought was actually really, really smart. To the media point, which is, of course, of particular interest to me. Oh, yeah, of course.
There's one last thing point I want to make about the collection thing. So I'm not sure how many people followed the crackdown in Burma, but there was I'm sure actually everyone in this community knows about it. There was a large and violent protest a large protest that was suppressed with extreme violence by the government, and it was one of the best cases of citizen journalism in terms of effective documentation, uploading of when they shot the Japanese reporter, that went up on YouTube really quickly, and so it was one of the most documented and clear cases of human rights abuses that occurred, and all through YouTube and Flickr. Now, the problem with this is, so first of all, once the government realized what was happening, they shut down the internet. This country had a single connection through the C-Drumar continental underwater fiber optic cable, which I'm saying just because I found it interesting to say, but so it was possible to cut them off because they were a node on the net. They were just they were an island, so there's one point in, one point out from a network topography standpoint. The horror occurred a few days later when the government turned the internet back on, and they went to Flickr, and they went to the pages, and they looked at the tagged people, and they used the Flickr photo streams to identify individuals to then be targeted late at night when they would go to their homes and pull them out of their homes and make them disappear. And I actually cry. It's really very hard for me to even talk about, as a technologist, how it makes me feel to feel so wonderfully empowered. Like, wow, Flickr is helping change this horrible situation. But at the same time, can it then be immediately turned around? It is equally powerful to be used by the oppressive government. And that is an example of them interacting with that system as a regular user. You know, I mean, like, there's some guy clicking, saying, oh, yep, print that out, handing those photos to people that are going to drive out late at night in trucks and capture and oppress people. It's horrible. And so the reason I say this is that collecting information is an intentional act, and it bears or when you do it, you incur responsibility for doing it. And so it's something that we all have to think about, where when you tag someone's name, you provide this increasing database of personally identifiable information. It is entirely possible that at some point in the future that will be used against you in a way that you could never have imagined. And so, as part of this dialogue, the issues with dissident suppression in China by Yahoo, and to some degree Microsoft and Google, separate cases in each of those, but this is what happens when you amass large bodies of data and you don't think about the consequences of that collection. And it's a true issue. So the fact that people probably died as a result of uploading photos to Flickr, that's a really, on the one hand, great documentation. On the other hand, it's sure a changing world with lots of complicated consequences.
Just sort of on this question of declining trust in the media, it's interesting because I think that what you're seeing happening structurally is that kind of when you're seeing the commoditization of news, which I think is actually something that makes a lot of people really nervous, but is kind of fundamentally a good thing in a lot of ways. But what it means is that in terms of providing kind of high quality investigative journalism, that kind of thing, increasingly this is going to move kind of in the direction of nonprofits, something that's already happening kind of to a small degree. So in terms of restoring that trust, that might be a part of it. But it also means that kind of the people who are going to be interested in kind of financing these organizations are going to oftentimes be the same people who are very interested in seizing control of the state for purposes of regulatory capture. By that I mean I think what we're going to see is more of the rise of partisan media. That is, we're going to investigate you because you're the opposition, or we're the opposition and we're going to investigate the government because we find you incredibly distasteful. So there's actually going to be a lot of investigative journalism. I think we're going to see it really flourish, but it's going to be of a kind of different nature. It's not going to be of the kind of classical public-spirited nature, although perhaps it will characterize itself as such, but rather it's going to be driven by sort of these really different economic imperatives. So I also think it's partly driven by sort of the nature of campaign finance regulations, and this is another kind of note about unintended consequences. You create these regulations intending to clean up the system, but what ends up happening is that there's a huge loophole where if I just open up a newspaper or call it a TV station, something like that, I can sort of do much the same as I was doing through the campaign finance system. So I think that that's probably going to further erode trust rather than increase it, and I think we're likely to move even further in that direction.
Hi. My cynical sort of public choice view about government regulation is that it tends not to be necessarily passed because there's a problem that needs to be solved so much as that the industry being regulated slows down enough that the bureaucrats can catch up to it. And you mentioned Skype, but of course the FCC has been trying to regulate Skype and other VoIP applications for a decade, and the problem is just that the regulations that are there now it does not make any sense to require Skype, for example.
I wasn't advocating regulation.
Well, but you were predicting it, and
right.
And so I'm just curious if you can, mostly Jesse, but the other two, if they also have comments, flesh out a little bit more about which services you think either need to or are likely to be regulated, and what aspects of them are most likely to?
Wow,
to
that
see
is a good question. Essentially, so I'm going to put on my firefighter hat real quick. So in this room right now, there's a limit to the number of people that are allowed to be in it. That limit is determined by the physical space, the number of exits, the sprinklers that are overhead, and there are things institutionally required that protect us. So on the door, there's something called panic hardware, which is there purely because people used to get killed being crushed against exit doors in stampedes to exit from burning buildings. And so the simple answer that I tend to give is when it becomes when a technology, an infrastructure has a sufficient number of people depending on it who do not walk into the room and say, man, is this sprinklered? Is there panic hardware on the walls? Like, if there were a fire in this room, every one of you would escape safely because you would, have all you need to know is to go out the door, which has, thankfully, exit signs located above it according to building code. So what I suspect is that we're going to see an evolution much more in terms of building codes, where it's when you build an application, when you build a technology, when you build something that a lot of people depend on, and there are certain implications, there are risks associated with more and more people depending on that. Those are going to be the first places where it is appropriate to either think about, industry sort of standards and practices that evolve into potentially regulations. Although, the building code evolved and then is adopted. So there's an organization that establishes standards, and then local agencies adopt building codes on a municipality by municipality basis, usually saying we accept the whole thing or we make a couple little changes. So I think that that's more of the model that I'm talking about, and less so in the case of Skype, which very clearly says in every one of their pieces of documentation that you can read, we are not a substitute for your phone service, and we are not a 911 service. Don't use us or rely on us for an emergency. However, all these people in Peru, they don't have a national telecommunications infrastructure, but it's really easy to spread the net around. So all you need is a satellite downlink and some kids with OLPCs, and they've got a mesh network. I mean, the point is that this stuff spreads a lot more easily, and so you need to think about it in terms of who your customers are and how people are depending on you. And the bigger the risk gets and the less educated about those risks people become, the more responsible you become to them with institutional controls and regulation.
I think you were admitting basically that the regulation and the legislation is the RL.
Yeah. I would prefer that technology offer consistently something better by default, and that we proceed forever in an environment in which we all, as technologists, do the right thing for everyone and build a safe, happy, and free world. I don't think that that's going to work all the time, and so you need controls on the other end in order to make sure that happens. Unfortunately, don't be evil isn't a guarantee, because there's no way to audit that to make sure that that's actually occurring. And so that's one of the best commitments that has ever been made. But how do we know? There's no public facility to audit that. There's no way to know.
I know. He's been waiting. Yeah. You and then in front of you, please.
Okay. Education has been mentioned several times, mostly in the context of resisting technology and non-scalable activity and things like that. And
he said that.
And so my question is, does anybody have any positive outlook, positive predictions for how cloud computing and massively collaborative applications can help with education? Both K through 12 and higher ed.
Yeah, I see it in K through 12 and higher ed, and I think the call it available or commoditized platforms for delivery of fairly simplistic collaboration tools. Again, these days simplistic. What I mean is they're not very deep vertical applications. They're just platforms for collaborating. Even things as simple as email. It used to be hard for a school to provide email to students, and now it's not. It's not hard at all. There is a little bit of a shift happening. It's very difficult to change behaviors and call it current regulations even, or acceptance and credibility of some of the commoditized services. And again, Google Apps is sort of right in the middle of that, providing email services at a flash at any domain, with complete white labeling and all that stuff. It's fairly straightforward and sort of, you know, a wall, or at least a virtual wall around your domain and protection. But there's tremendous opportunity for children to learn at the K through 12 and higher ed level that this is standard, that this is what should be expected, because it should. I mean, it should actually be accepted and expected that you can connect with other people within your community and outside of it in a safe way and in a way that doesn't really, you know, hopefully cost anything, or cost very little. And then there's all kinds of even very small things that I see done in K through 12, and again, my experience is K through 1. You know, it's really, I have young children, and I see their awareness of technology. It's shocking, but, you know, and I have a little bit to do with it, you know, but to introduce them to things that would otherwise be taken for granted. And there's a backwards motion where students are encouraging and expecting from their educators more in the way of use of technology because they see it at home. And they have it at home and amongst their friends. And that, I think, is a very positive shift as long as, you know, the teachers and the ones I work with are very willing to change and willing to use some of the tools that are out there. That's not true across the board, but I think that shift will be very strong. And from what I've heard, again, these are public stories just about the One Laptop Per Child program, is that was one of the most difficult things to deal with. Putting one of those things in the hand of a child whose mind is a sponge and can pick that thing up and start using it and not afraid to push all the buttons and try everything and turn the video on and start recording and you know, communicate and instant message with their friends. Suddenly the teacher is put up against a wall, and it is a scary thing. So I kind of commend what they're trying to do in terms of teacher education, but that's critical, is to, you know, try to bring the teacher, you know, up to speed with where the children could get, you know, much more naturally, just because of their level of, you know, how fast they learn, and they don't have to have all this stuff in their brain that now can be thrown away, unfortunately.
You know, one of my favorite writers is the science fiction novelist Werner Vinge, who kind of has a book called Rainbow's End. It's actually not his best, but it's certainly interesting in terms of technology and how he talks about education. And he kind of, you know, imagines kind of this world where you're trying to teach people creativity. You have, you know, kind of older people who've been left behind, and also kind of, you know, kind of younger, you know, kind of together collaborating in different ways. And when I think about, you know, kind of how kind of cloud computing can facilitate education, I think about really radical experimentation, and I also think about, you know, homeschooling cooperatives. Homeschooling cooperatives are interesting because you have a situation where, you know, let's say you're a homeschooler, the problem with it is that it really doesn't scale. You've just learned how to teach a 5th grader, and guess what? Your kid's now in the 6th grade, and you're never going to use that knowledge ever again. Seems a little silly, and so that's why, you know, kind of you have a lot of parents, oftentimes hippies or, you know, kind of Christian conservatives, et cetera, getting together and, you know, kind of trying to sort of draw on each other's expertise, et cetera, and finding other ways to cooperate. Now, all of these technologies we're talking about, these technologies that seem to be, you know, kind of helping sort of 15-year-olds flirt with each other, are things that have actually really helped these homeschooling parents, you know, kind of bulk up their skills, and also, you know, kind of use MIT's OpenCourseWare, for example, to kind of, you know, give more advanced kids the kind of, you know, education that they need. So my hope would be that the alternative to, you know, kind of public schools where it's kind of hard to scale up, particularly when you're not willing to do something about separating out disruptive students and other kids who have special needs and give them the kind of the real resources that they need, that, you know, you'd have more middle-class parents who would be a little bit more adventurous in terms of allowing their kids to kind of have the broader run of the city. I grew up in Brooklyn, and sometimes I think about the number of adjunct professors, the number of ABD, you know, kind of like house husbands and housewives around, and these tremendously rich educational resources, and these people who are not able to link up with the kids who kind of need their help and assistance. And then I think of the boom in private tuition services. If you look at Kumon, you know, for example, sort of, you know, this, you know, sort of, I believe it's a sort of Korean company that's become hugely popular in the suburbs of New York. But geez, I mean, the kids who really need Kumon are not necessarily the kids who can pay for it. And finding ways to kind of facilitate sort of social cooperation, to kind of make that kind of thing happen, have learning happen in sort of really different environments. You know, another thing that came to mind is, you know, Coetzee's new novel, Diary of a Bad Year. He talks about how in Poland, during the waning days of the communist government, you know, you would have secret seminars where people who would have been graduate students in the free world were getting together and meeting in someone's dining table and reading Rousseau. And about the only real authority, the only credential you'd ever have, maybe is a certificate signed by the person who taught you, and it was their credibility that was on the line. Imagine if high school teachers, you know, kind of felt that level of responsibility. If this person doesn't know how to, you know, kind of differentiate, it's my personal fault. So, I mean, I kind of think that that's what I'm excited about, these really, really different models that take place outside of the conventional school.
Hi, Peter Landwehr, Carnegie Mellon. I'm curious about the SLA issue here, and I've sort of I was in Chicago last year where they were planning to install Wi-Fi citywide, and it was ended up being a big fallover. But when they were in the planning stages of this, they went to the 4 parts of the city, or 3 parts really, but they had included the middle in that, and they went and asked community organizers what they wanted to see, what they wanted out of this service. And in fact, the same consistent group of community organizers showed up at these meetings and basically said that really the people in these constituencies, except for maybe in the north side, really didn't need municipal Wi-Fi. They needed computers and they needed training. And that they really had fundamental issues like wanting to apply for jobs that only took resumes over email, but they didn't even know how to use email systems. So it seems like there is definitely not only, say, a digital divide and OLPC issue in Africa, there's clearly an underclass in America that really doesn't know this. Now, in this digital divide, advocates will also often, claim that this is a broadening thing, and this comes into this Google Maps situation that you mentioned with the Red Cross, where even if Google had an SLA for their service, do you think that it would be parsable for every single Red Cross employee you dealt with on the phone?
Somebody made a technology decision. So someone wrote a policy, and Google actually does have SLAs, and they actually had all the stuff that, I was using what I wanted the Red Cross to use. We were doing overlays in Google Earth. So the answer there is this is about education of it, or how we educate adopters and how we educate innovators. So there was an innovator at the Red Cross that was doing the right thing fundamentally, which was, hooray, we've got this great service which changes GIS for us. We can now do this incredibly powerful new thing. The problem was that the understanding and literally the policy around that did not allow them to change. Now that was indicative of a lot of other problems with the Red Cross response during Katrina, which was an inflexibility to change policies when they were not working in the field. So I mean that's not I was very happy with my experience with Google Maps and with Google Earth and with other tools like it. So
I guess what the key point here is that it seemed to me, and I think to many, certainly everyone in this room, Google Maps is something that you use very intuitively, and I think that we all, I assume, operate on the basic assumption that yes, those satellite maps are dated. So again, there's sort of a knowledge gap here that is assumed not to be present, and that a service like Google Maps that is so easy to pick up and is emphasized for ease to pick up in our society, in fact, does have this implicit knowledge gap in it. So, I mean, I'd be curious about your thoughts about dealing with those issues.
So it's a technology education problem. It's again, there was a person that implemented the Red Cross integrated command system, whatever that might be. So the person that I want to reach is not the entire public to educate them about how timely or not Google Mapping is. Instead, it's the widget creator who is going. There's going to be a lot more people building tools like this that people can depend on, and that's the focus that I'm talking about. It's why it can't be purely an academic response. It needs to be much more broadly disseminated, and I don't have great answers.
Yeah, but I do think the implementer, the person, the innovator, the person that sort of selected and was the leader in that community, has to take responsibility for putting out there the information that community needs to use that service properly. And we find that a lot. And the only example I can think of is somebody decided, I don't think it's regulatory. I mean, somebody here might know the difference. When I turn on my nav system in my car, it says basically stop reading this and look at the road, right? And don't use this to get yourself out of a jam. Otherwise, you're going to end up dying in a cavern somewhere, following the wrong road or something. And that's critical. That's somebody, and it would have been easy for the Red Cross to do that in their gadget. The first thing that comes up to say, by the way, these are old maps.
Stop arguing with Jesse.
Yeah. And listen to the firefighters on the ground; they know more. But ironically, we updated maps.
I yelled about that too,
and that's probably why.
Yelled about the other one.
It's interesting, exactly. But I do. The education, that education sort of goes in layers. We need to provide the service as a service provider underlying to allow people to educate other people. So if my help content is good, they can point them to the right help content.
I find it sort of interesting, this last discussion. It seems to be two disparate questions. We're going to link them together, the one on education and then your response just now. Jesse, you framed it as Google, it's the widget designer where you would place the burden. The flip side of it is, why not on the data provider to be timestamping the data?
So I mean, your
They do.
choice as to where and how that plays in. I mean, that choice clearly, you can have your widget people and your other service provider fighting each other as to whose responsibility it is.
Absolutely.
In the GPS case, it's most likely a tort liability reason
Right.
why they put it there, because they don't
Absolutely.
want to be sued
Yeah.
for contributing to a car accident.
Right.
But here's where I want to bring it back to the discussion about education. Because I think the discussion that I heard coming from the panel and a little bit from the audience is relatively naive from what's actually happening in the K-12 education world. And it really relates to how you go about certifying, or how do you have authoritative, I don't want to say authoritative education, but how do you know the authority of the information that you're conveying? It's one thing if you want to try to have some kind of homeschool network of fifth grade, somebody in Brooklyn has done fifth grade. Well, how does the parent distinguish between a charlatan and somebody who really knows what he's talking about? This is a huge problem that educators have and that regulators have in regulating education, which is done at a state level. So when you look at the problem of getting computers into schools and getting them used, it really cuts it a whole series of very complex levels that I don't think you can distill down as simplistically, at least as I heard it here.
I was talking more about virtually closed networks, though. I wasn't talking about finding information that anybody could put up there. I was talking about a place where it would still require policy and approval. The principal or somebody, some board of other teachers would probably say, okay, if you're going to put something out here for our first graders, it'll first go through a little bit of review. In other words, not anybody can do it. But clearly, if you're opening the web publicly and you're saying, yeah, kids can search and we don't know what they're going to see, if that's what you're talking about, clearly there's the ability for someone else to throw stuff in there that's not credible.
Let me give a real example that's come up. I sit on a board of education in my town, and the question is, we're trying to make more of what happens in the school transparent for the parents. So the simple question is, okay, let's put homework assignments, have teachers put homework assignments online, and have other, do they put their grade books online?
Right.
And we start to parse out the problems that it raises. The first question is, all right, who has the computers? Who's going to fund the purchase of the computers? Because the teacher needs it, the students need it. What happens with, we have a digital divide in our community, and our community is probably one of the wealthiest in the state. And we have a fair number of kids in the schools who don't have access at home to computers. Then you run into the educational policy problems it raises. What if the teacher's pedagogical perspective is it's the student's responsibility to be listening in class? We want them to be listening in class. I don't want it online because then it undermines the responsibility message I'm trying to convey. So I think when you start thinking about how do you design the technology, how do you deploy it in the classroom, in that instance, there are some very significant structural obstacles.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it's not a simple problem to solve. I wasn't trying to claim that. It's just that I still think that it's not even considered for use in so many cases, and that you guys have gotten very far, it sounds like, in that discussion.
We are at 3:03 by my laptop, so maybe this is a good time to stop. And Ed, are you coming?
Well, thanks to these panelists for giving us a fitting wrap up to the workshop. Many open questions left here. Thanks as well to our other panelists, speakers, and moderators for participating and making this a really interesting and thought-provoking workshop overall. I also want to thank the people who made this workshop possible. We want to thank again Microsoft for their financial support for the workshop. I want to thank David Robinson, who really is primarily responsible for the planning of the workshop and recruiting speakers, and he did obviously very well at that. We also want to give special thanks to Laura Cummings-Abdo, who was responsible for all of the logistics and made everything run beautifully smoothly despite being new on the job here. So a special round of applause for that. And finally, I want to thank all of you for coming and participating. I've really enjoyed this workshop. We'll be running another workshop here in May on a topic to be determined related to somehow to information technology policy. And now I'll dismiss you all, and we'll see you in the cloud.